everybody. Sorry for the delay. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of both the Meth Mig Standing Committee of IMISCOE and the Institute for Advanced Social Studies, part of the Spanish Research Council. We've organized this event together. Some of you are familiar with the IESA and some with the Meth Mig franchise. Those of you who are from elsewhere and don't know what the IESA is, we are like 30 years old. We grew up with a lot of applied social research. We're more academic now. We got 4 departments or working groups that all cover relevant social topics. And although we now publish a lot in peer-reviewed journals, we're still very interested in social impact. We have a website if you're interested in learning more. Now, Agatha joins me to represent the Meth Mig Standing Committee, of which I'm also part, but I'm now speaking in my quality as Deputy Director. The Director of the IESA, Rafa Serrano, sends his apologies, he can't be here today. So Agatha, she will present the Meth Mig Standing Committee very briefly.
Very briefly, we are the standing committee, 1 out of 10 standing committees in the IMISCOE network from 2019, I think. I joined later, but there are 5-6 people who are keen on methods in migration research, what is important, not only survey methods, but also qualitative and quantitative and mixed, all kinds of methodological issues. We try to get involved in publishing, so you can check on our website the publications we already contributed. We are doing some events, networking, training, and also involving in other initiatives which are on the intersection of ethics and methods that the last stream we found extremely important in methodological discussion. So we welcome you to join us on the Twitter and maybe even join the standing committee as such. It's possible via IMISCOE site. Yes, it's possible. It's possible. Okay, I'll welcome you today for the workshop.
Well, the implied message being you can become a member of the Meth Mig Standing Committee. Just click on that link on our website. Now, as for the rationale, we had a similar workshop last year in Warsaw on new data sources. Why do I say similar? Because when we organize a specific event, not part of the general IMISCOE annual conference, but a specific Meth Mig branded event, we seek cross-cutting methodological issues that wouldn't be triable in terms of who's interested and who can contribute. So we did that trick again today with the focus on bias, which surely qualitative survey, new data, and whatnot, people have something to say about and some concern related to that. Now, as I said, I apologize for the delay. We have a no-go area starting 8:30, where we really should be leaving. So if we asked all participants in the panel sessions to be very brief from baseline, I can't but insist that you really have to be very brief in your presentations. There are going to be 6 panelists this afternoon after the keynote session. We can keep the refreshments short and beautiful, but still, what we are really after is debate on those cross-cutting issues. So do focus on your take-home message, on your lessons learned, please. 6 short conference-style presentations are unbearable. Sorry to say that. So we won't have that. And if you have any PowerPoint to upload, please do so during the refreshment break. Now, it's an immense pleasure for me to welcome Melanie Revilla. I'm not really good at exaggerating, or so I think, but I think she's easily counted among the best and brightest in the European survey research community, and I mean it. So, again, you can click on those links to know about her merits. I'm very grateful for her to make it because apart from a first-rate professional, she's also a young mother, and she's made the impossible possible to be here with us today, so I really appreciate it. She's running a project, an ERC starting grant project that you will learn a bit about today in the presentation, but do click on those links, they're in the booklet, because they have a lot on store, and it's very interesting. She's also a chief editor for MDA, which is an up-and-coming journal. Also very interesting if you're interested in publishing at all in survey methodology. And well, that's where I take it. I'm really grateful for you to be here. You got like 50 minutes roughly, and then we'll have a debate. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here today to speak about this Web Data Hub project, which is the name of this ERC-funded project on which we are working for now almost 3 years. And the topic of the project is complementing conventional web survey data with new measurement opportunities with the hope that we can achieve better or new insight. So what are these new opportunities we are focusing on? Well, these new opportunities are really related to the growing use of internet. So we know that more and more of people's life is happening online. And this is not new. We are hearing this kind of statement for almost 20 years, I think. But it's still increasing. So if we look at the average daily time spent online by each internet user, from 2016 to 2021, it still increased half an hour almost. So it's still increasing. And within this time that we spend online, there are more and more of it that is spent through smartphones or mobile devices in general. So there is around 83% of the world population having smartphones, and if we focus on internet users, 92% of them are using internet through smartphones as well. So thanks to this growing use of internet, and in particular of mobile internet, there are different kinds of new measurement opportunities that have been appearing for researchers. And in this project, our focus are the opportunities that are related to the collection of different types of data beyond the conventional survey answers that we can get. So in particular, mobile devices, they have sensors that are always included, like a camera, a GPS, a microphone, but also we can install app very easily. So all this allows to collect different kinds of data. And these data are different. So for instance, the data we get from the GPS is very different from the one we get from the camera. But at the same time, there are a lot of benefits and challenges that are really shared by these different types of data. So the idea of the project was that we should look at more than one because they have a lot in common, but we should also study them separately because they have their own specificities. So for the project, I propose to work on 4 different types of data. The first one, that is visual data. So with mobile devices having a camera, there are more and more pictures that are taken and that are shared by people all around the world every day. So it seems that this is becoming very common to take and share pictures. And the idea was, if this is a common activity for many people in their daily life, could we also use it within the frame of survey? So instead of asking people to answer questions in a conventional way, can we ask them to share visual data, which can be screenshots, which can be photos or videos that they are taken during the survey, or visual files that are already saved on the devices they use to answer the survey. And then they use this data to answer survey questions. Besides the visual data, the second kind of data we are interested in is voice data. So here again, I think we are observing that more and more people are using voice inputs on their mobile devices. For instance, in WhatsApp, when I started using it like 10 years back, people were sending text messages. But now even in the group of the class of my son, they are sending voice messages. So this is becoming more and more common. And similarly, the idea was, if people are used to do that, if they do it in their daily life, it must be for something, because they like it or because they find it efficient, but it should be for something. So can we also use this in the frame of web survey? And in this case, in particular for open questions, when smartphones started to be used to answer a web survey, we observed that people were typing shorter answers. And so the idea was, now if we propose them to answer open narrative questions, so when we want long answers from them using voice inputs, which can be both dictation, so they speak and the voice is immediately transcribed into a text, or that can be just a voice recording. No? So this is the second type of data we are considering. Then we are working with metadata, so this is quite different. In that case, the idea is not that within a conventional survey we will ask for a specific type of data that is different, but metadata are part of this bigger family that is called digital trace data, which itself is part of a bigger family that is called passively collected data or big data. No? So in the case of the metadata, what you get is really information about the online activities of people. So you get the URL of all the web pages that people are visiting in the devices where they have installed a tracking application that is called a meta. So you can observe the behaviors of what people are doing online in the devices where the tracker is installed. So usually this is done actually through method panels, which are actually panels of people that were part already of an opt-in or access online panel. So these are people that accepted to answer web survey regularly, usually in exchange for points or for money. And these people were asked by the companies running these big panels to also install this tracker, and the ones that accepted are then sharing the metadata on a continuous way, and in addition, they answer web surveys. So in the project, our interest is, from a methodological point of view, see if and how we can use this metadata to measure concepts that might not be measured with survey or might be poorly measured with survey data. And the last kind of data we are interested in is what we call in-the-moment surveys that are triggered by specific events. So the idea is that if we detect that someone is visiting a website of interest or is doing something online of interest, for instance, right now, the application on which we are working is job application. So if we detect that someone is applying for a job online using the metadata, we immediately send, within 5 minutes, a survey invitation to this person asking about why did you apply to this specific offer? Did you fulfill all the requirements of the offer? Do you remember the salary if it was said in the offer? How much was it? Etc., etc. So things that we believe that by asking just after the event occurred, people can remember much better than if we would ask them in a conventional survey. And in the case of in-the-moment survey, we are also interested in surveys that are triggered by geolocation data, so kind of the similar of metadata, but for offline events. So in that case, it would mean, for instance, that we detect that people are visiting an hospital and we send them a survey to ask, why did you go to the hospital? Why are you satisfied with the services of the doctors today, or whatever? Okay? So these are the 4 types of data we are interested in the project, and it's important to note that they are not only about smartphones, even if before we had the picture of the smartphone and we said that the mobile participation helps a lot in collecting this kind of data. It's not only limited to this kind of data. For instance, the voice experiment we are running right now, we also allow people to answer from their PCs because most laptops also have a microphone. So all these different kinds of data, the idea is that they could help researchers and also participants. So we expect benefits on both sides. And I will try to summarize them quite quickly now. So the first main type of benefits that we expect from this kind of new data is that they could reduce measurement errors that we know we have in survey data. So I'm basically, at the beginning at least, I was a survey methodologist, no, and now I'm moving toward other kinds of data. And I've been working during many years on measurement errors in surveys, and after seeing how large these measurement errors might be for measuring many concepts of interest, the idea was we need to do something else because some of the measurements we got in surveys are just so bad. And one idea was, well, this kind of new data, well, for different type of concept, for instance, all the concepts that are about past behaviors. We know from all the research that exists about survey that people do not recall properly many things that we're asking them about in surveys. And sometimes they think they recall, but in fact, they don't recall the way it happens. So this is a very famous phenomenon in psychology, that the remembering self is not the same as the experiencing self, which means that how I remember things is not how I experience them, which I think is why people have more than one kid. Otherwise, we'd have probably stopped after one, no? So in all these kind of things, I think that we might improve with the new kinds of data. And also another big category are all the social desirable questions. So all these questions about sensitive topics where people tend to just lie to present themselves positively, even in web surveys, so even without the presence of an interviewer. Well, if you use passively collected data, in principle, it's much more difficult to lie because you need to really stop doing the behavior or do it in some devices where the meter is not installed, etc. Besides the potential of reducing measurement errors, these new kinds of data provide a larger amount of data than what you can normally collect through typical or conventional survey questions. This is particularly the case for the metadata, but also, for instance, for visual data. So there is the famous adage that an image is worth 1,000 words, which tells it all, no? And in the case of the passive data, besides, I told it before, it's collected in real time and in a continuous way, which means that at the end, this kind of data can be used to measure new concepts that we didn't even try to measure before in survey data because we knew it would just fail, or to answer new research questions. For instance, when a crisis is happening, like when the war in Ukraine started, something that you didn't know exactly when it would happen, well, if you have the metadata, you will have the data from just before and just after because they are collected minute after minute on a continuous way. So you could look immediately how people change their online behavior when they learned about the war and then how it evolves with time, etc. And this is something that you didn't need to plan ahead. On the participant side, on the other hand, we also expect benefits, in particular for visual data and voice, because people do use them in normal life. We expect that this would be more enjoyable than just answering lists of agree-disagree scales, for instance, and that it would be less effort and time, in particular in the case of the passive data. This is clear because they only have to set up the tracking application and then they do not have to do anything anymore. So we do expect that the benefits are not for all concepts, of course, so it's not the end of conventional questions for sure, but that there are many different applications where we could benefit from using this different kind of data. Unfortunately, things are not that easy, and if many people can just think that using this kind of new data is straightforward, the reality is that it is really complicated. And each time we try more, we find just even more problems. So this is really not easy at that point, I would say. And one of the big problems is that using survey is also really not easy. And actually, I was using these same pictures, just sending new data for survey data some years back in my class for my student when teaching survey design. The big difference is that we have a lot of knowledge about survey data, and we have almost no knowledge about a new type of data. That's why they are new. No, that's the definition. So the main goal of this web data project is, well, let's try to get some more knowledge. We will not be able to get all the one we need, of course, but let's try to start in that direction to get a little bit more knowledge and to get in a situation more similar to survey where it's also difficult, but we know, for instance, that agree-disagree scales are bad, or we know we should avoid using grids because for many years already research has been done on these topics. So this is to give you like the more general overview of what we are looking at in the project. And now for the second part of the presentation, I want to go through two more specific examples. So I'm not a specialist at all about migration, so I try to find some questions that might be relevant, but maybe you say they're already answered and very well, but I think it could be similar presentation with other questions, so it's just for an illustration purpose. But let's say that we are interested in studying the changes in housing conditions of people just after they migrate to a new country. No? So you move to one country to another, and this can be for many different reasons. And it might be that in some cases you move even if your housing conditions are getting much worse, and in other cases you may want to move exactly because you want to improve your housing conditions. No? And let's see how we could study these kind of questions using visual data instead of only conventional survey data. So let's say that we have this kind of research questions. Now, how migrants' housing conditions change after migrating, and in particular, for which kind of migrants do they improve, for which kind of migrants do they get worse, for which kind of migrants maybe they stay the same. And housing condition is quite general, so we might want to focus on something more specific without the housing conditions. It could be, for instance, how comfortable we think that the new house is compared to the previous house of the people, but it could be more specific topic about that, like how many people move from precarious housing conditions to non-precarious one, or whatever you want in this line. No? So if we have this kind of research questions, how can we answer to them? Well, in the first step, what we need clearly is to identify migrants. That is necessary for doing all the rest of the research, but this part is not really where the new kinds of data can help, so we could do just that using surveys. The more interesting step is the second one, where we want to collect information about housing conditions. So in that case, we could say, okay, this can be done through conventional survey. I can just ask about the previous housing condition, and I can ask questions about the current housing condition, and people should be able to answer such questions. So I would expect most people to recall what were the housing conditions before and after migrating if they are new migrants or somehow new migrants. But we can also expect many different kinds of bias, because when asking about the current housing conditions, we could expect people to have social desirable answers. If you just move to a country and you're asked about your conditions in this country, you might feel bad about saying, no, I'm in horrible conditions. And then people would say, well, then what are you doing here? Just come back to your country. No? So people might feel kind of obliged to say something more positive about the current housing conditions. And on the other side, when asking about previous housing conditions, people might not recall them the way they were, and in particular, if they feel nostalgic about their house, they just moved to a different country. Maybe they start missing their friends, their family, and things from the home country, the food or whatever. And this means that at the end, when asked also about the housing condition, they might be more positive than if they would have been asked just before leaving, for instance. So we can expect bias in many different directions, and we could say, okay, so maybe it's better to ask, instead of survey questions in a conventional way, to share pictures that would be more objective and from which we can extract the information we need. And besides, we expect much more information from a picture than just if asking to them to evaluate if it changed and in which direction. No? So we could ask pictures of where they lived before, and that would be pictures that they already have on their devices, but we can expect many people, if they just move, to have such pictures. And then we can ask pictures of where they are living right now, and that could be pictures they take during the survey, which would allow the researcher to ask for more details or for more photos that are more taken in the way that is good for then doing the analysis. No? And then we will have still a next step if using images, which is to extract the information, but I will speak more about step 2 and step 3 just in a minute. So if we want to do that, it looks all nice, no? But again, things are not that easy. And the first problem is that the current survey software existing, like Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, Google Form, etc., they do not allow you to collect visual data that is, for instance, taken during the survey. So the very first problem is that you need a specific tool to be able to get such data within the frame of a web survey. And there were some tools developed by private companies, but there were really not a good tool that people could use for free. So in the frame of the Web Data project, one of the first things that we have been doing is developing such a tool. The problem is that even with what we developed, it's still not that easy because the tool is not working just by itself. It's not an application. It's a code that you need to embed within the survey software that you are using. So it means that you still need to have some programming skill to be able to do it, or to have someone programming for you to be able to do it. And another big issue is still where do you save all the files of all the photos or videos that people are sending to you? So what we propose in the manual of this tool is to use Amazon Web Service, but still it means you need to have an account, you need to pay for that. So all this is already quite complicated and cannot be done if you are really a lone researcher, for instance, doing your PhD in most cases. No? Now let's say that we solve the problem and that we can really, on a technical point of view, collect and save the images. Then the second problem is, are respondents really sending the images when asked to do so? And we did a first experiment before starting with the ERC in which we find that around half of the respondents were sending the pictures and the other half didn't. So when we started with the ERC, what we did is try to understand the mechanism behind that, try to understand why we got such a low participation. And we did this work with Patricia Iglesias, who is doing her PhD on this topic. And so what we did is try to ask about different aspects that could link to non-response. So do people have the skill to really do that? Do people have the data available? And do people are willing to do it? And what we find is that the main problem seems actually to be the availability for Spain, because most people really had the skills, and except for doing a screenshot on a PC, where it was a bit lower, but otherwise it was more than 95%. And the willingness was actually also quite high. If you do manage to get the images, then you still have one more big problem, which is that you cannot just conclude about your research questions directly from the images. It's not like having a radio button questions and the options already give you results and you just have to take a tab or something, summarize, and you will get your answers. If you get images, you need to extract the information of interest from the images, which is a process that is called classification. And this is something that will completely actually really affect the final quality of your data. So depending how you extract the information, the data quality at the end using the images might be much lower or much higher. And the problem is, again, that doing this classification is really not an easy task. And there is a full field working on this kind of things that is computer vision, and there they have a lot of knowledge, but they are not working with survey data, and people normally working with survey data are not expert in computer vision. So we tried actually within the Web Data project to create a practical guide for researchers that are not from computer vision field to try to understand better the issue of classification and the problems and how you can do it better. So the main problem is first to define exactly which information you want to extract from the images, which labels you will give to this information, and then how you will extract it. Are you going to do it just manually, which probably might be more performant in some cases, but then takes a lot of time and is really not efficient in terms of cost? Or are you going to try to use automatically codification, so for instance through machine learning algorithm? But then you are limited towards the kind of things that you can extract. So just to illustrate that a bit further, going back to the example, let's say that we got a migrant and that this person sent 2 pictures of the housing conditions in the country of origin, and then 2 pictures of the housing condition in the new country. And from that, you will want to deduce if the housing conditions improved or get worse or stay the same. Well, here a human ace can probably conclude that in the new country, the housing conditions seem somehow worse than in the home country, even if it is quite subjective, and some of you might disagree with that. But if you try to automatize this kind of extraction of information with existing API that are doing this kind of stuff, like Google Vision, you will get something that is completely useless, because the kind of classification that already exists for this kind of images gives you information like window, house on one side and building on the other. So you cannot use existing API for that. So it means that the two options you would have is manually, but it means a lot of time and work and a lot of subjectivity also in the classification potentially, or develop your own algorithm, but for that you will still need manually first to code questions, then train your data. So you need a lot of data, a lot of experts, and a lot of time to do such a thing. So actually a topic like that, at this day, the only option almost would be to do it manually, which would still mean a lot of time. No? So it would really not be easy. And of course, it's even more problem. No? We have even more problem when trying to use visual data. One very famous one is selection bias, which is a problem we always have with any kind of data collection. No? But here we have the additional question of, are the people that are sending the images different from the people that are not sending images? And probably the question is yes, at least on some aspect, like in terms of privacy, there are probably different levels of privacy issue or things like that. But the good point here is that we do have a lot of information about the people that are not sending images as well, which is not the case when you try to compare, for instance, people that participate or do not participate in a survey, because the way we did it, at least so far, when trying to ask for visual data, this was just one question within a conventional survey, and it was not compulsory. So if people didn't send a picture, they could just go on, and actually in some cases, in some experiments, we even had an option of I don't want to do it or I don't know how to do it, and they could continue, which means that we have information about all the other variables for these people. So in terms of, for instance, doing weighting or matching, we have a lot of information available, which is not always the case. And of course, depending on the target population, it might be more or less problematical to have this kind of selection bias. We also have, as always with survey data, data protection and ethical issues. But again, here they are more important even, because if we're asking for visual data, it's very likely that people do not realize everything that you can see on the images they are sending. So if I'm asking for the images of the living room, as we saw before, it might be that on some of the wall there is some pictures of the kids or some personal information with some names, and they might not realize, like here, if I take a picture of the room, I may not realize that there is this information just here on the wall. So they might send the visual data without realizing everything they are sharing, which is quite different from answering just radio button questions. So the problem is much bigger as soon as you ask visual data. And if they send, for instance, faces of people that are third parties and did not accept to share their face with us, you can have really much more problem in terms of data protection issues. And there are more problems, but I will move to the second example. So in the second example, let's say that now we want to look at online news media exposure, which is a topic that has been used quite a lot already in the literature using metadata. That I would say the concept that has been most measured so far using metadata. And in that case, because we want something about migrants, let's say that we want to know about the migrants' online news media exposure. So the kind of research questions we might have is like, when someone is migrating to a new country, is this person still reading the news from the home country, or is the person more looking at the news from the new country, for instance? And if we were thinking more in terms of TV news, for instance, it's less relevant, because when moving, it's more likely that you start watching the TV in the country where you are, because it's what you can easily access. But for online news, it's very easy to continue reading the news from your home country, even if you are in a different country. So we can really wonder if the news that migrants are reading are mainly coming from the country of origin or the new country, or both equally, or still other countries. And probably there are different kinds of migrants having different kinds of mix. We may want to identify them, or we may want to identify factors that are affecting that, like, is it that the more you stay in a new country, the more you start reading the news of this new country, or is it more related with the education of the migrants, etc., etc. Okay? So if we have this kind of research questions, again, how can we answer them? Well, first we need to identify migrants, one more, and we said we could do that with survey. But if we are going to work with metadata anyway, which is the case in this example, we could also use the metadata to try to identify some migrants. So for instance, I'm French, I live in Spain. If they look at my metadata, each time I connect to internet, the first page I'm opening is google.fr. So if in your Spanish panel you see that each time there is a new session, it starts with google.fr, probably the person is not Spanish. No, it would be quite strange. So you could use that as a first way to detect who can be a migrant, for instance, and then send a survey to make sure that this is the case. No? Then we would need to get information about the online news media exposure. And again, we could say, okay, we can do that also in survey data. This has been done actually quite a lot in survey data. There are many, many surveys that have been asking about which kind of news are you reading, and which kind of newspaper, how much time do you spend on them, how often you visit them, etc., etc. But there is also a lot of literature already showing that people are bad in estimating this kind of numbers. People are bad in estimating the time they spend on any kind of activity. And when moving to online activity, this gets even worse because online activities are very often not something where you are fully concentrated on that. It's something that you do while you are in the metro maybe, or something that you do, but then it's someone is speaking to you, so you are stopping and coming back, etc. And the kind of events are often very repetitive, and so it's difficult to distinguish one from the other, so people are really very bad on that. So if we are doing it through conventional survey question, we know that we can expect a large bias in the estimates we will get. So we could say, okay, there is this meta existing. It is allowing us to get information about all the URL people are visiting. It's normally also providing information about the time they spend on each of the URL. It's also providing normally information about the use of app that can be used for media also. So we can use this information to get a better estimate of the online news media exposure. And then if we want also to look at different factors that affect this exposure, well, we can ask them in a complementary survey because, as I said before, normally metadata are collected in the frame of method panel where people both share the meta and also answer surveys, so there is no problem in getting the additional information we need. But again, things are much more complicated if you try to really do it. So let's say that we want to measure this online news media exposure and we want to distinguish it for the news coming from different countries. So this is our concept of interest, but as it would be the case if we are using also survey data, we have to differentiate the concept from the measure of this concept. Okay? And again, the problem is that in survey, there is a lot of research done about how to operationalize concept into survey questions and which kind of errors we can expect depending on how we operationalize our concepts. But there is almost nothing when we are looking not only at metadata, but actually at big data in general. And so far, there are more than 70 papers that have been published using metadata, and in none of them they are explaining how they operationalize the concept using metadata. They just say, I'm measuring online news media exposure using metadata. No more information. But actually, how do you create the measure using the metadata? Metadata is a series of URLs. So from that, you need to do something to transform it into a measure of online news media. And you need to take many decisions for that. For instance, which are the URL that really you will count as considered as news media. So it means that you need to find a list of all the website or the web page that can contain news such that you can then match this list with the behaviors of the people and know when they are exposed to news media and when they are not. You also need, for instance, to decide if you are only going to go at the domain level. So, for instance, theguardian.com would be a website where you expect people to read news. But you could say, yeah, but there is a sports section, and if they read about sport, this is not really what I call news in my research, so I don't want to use all the web page within The Guardian. I want to exclude the ones that are about sport. So you need to go into much more details for each one of the websites, and you may have a list of at least 200 websites to look at in a specific country. So it means you need a lot of knowledge about the media in this country, and you need to be able to read some content and do yourself things, how you can classify content, etc. You also need to decide what you will consider exposure, and this is actually more similar to surveys. So in some survey, they ask about frequency, in some survey they ask about the number of visits, and in other survey they ask about the time spent. Here you also need to decide this kind of stuff. And you also need to decide, and this is a very complex one again, how many days of tracking you want to use to compute this measure. And when using survey data, people tend to do something that makes all the burden on the respondent, which is, I'm going to ask you, on an average day, how much time do you spend reading news online? But if you use metadata, you can ask about an average day. You have to compute this average day. And to compute it, you need to decide how many days of tracking you want. And you could say, okay, the more days, the better, for sure. But the more days, the more expensive. Can you afford to pay for more days? Metadata is much more expensive than conventional survey data so far. So what you want is actually to have the minimum number of days such that your results are robust enough. So you need to take all these decisions. And again, there is almost no research to help you so far. So that's why in the frame of the project, we started working on this concept of online news media exposure, but with no focus on migrants, and considering only written and national news. And what, in this case, I'm working with Oriol Bosch, who is doing his PhD at the LSE, but is also part of the project. And he came up with all this list of potential choices that could be used and crossed to operationalize the concept that we have just mentioned, online news media exposure. And actually, by combining all the decisions that you can see in the table, we could create more than 8,000 variables, and they are all measures of the same concept, but operationalized in different ways. And the good point is that in survey data, if you want to test 8,000 ways of asking the questions, you would need many, many survey respondents or a lot of surveys. With metadata, you can do it with the same data set, so that's the good point. But then still, what do you do with all these variables? Which one is the best? So what we did with Oriol so far is look first at the convergent validity, which means to what extent all these measures really correlate with each other. If they are all measuring the same concept, they should correlate highly. And we did that using the triple data, which is the first data set, I think, ever that is using metadata in several countries at the same time combined with survey data. And in this case, we focus on 3 countries, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And what we find in a very, very summarized way is that the convergent validity was only low to average. So it means that the 8,000 ways of creating the same variable, they actually do not correlate so much. So all these decisions really affect what we are measuring. And beside that, we also look at predictive validity using the concept of political knowledge as the variable that we should predict. So the idea from previous literature was that the more people are exposed to news online, the more political knowledge they will have. So political knowledge was measured with survey questions, and then we look how much it correlates with the 8,000 different measures of online exposure. And here we find that there are really high fluctuations again in the predictive validity depending on the choices we make. So summarizing, the choices we make when operationalizing with metadata are as important as the one we make when operationalizing with survey data. The difference is that we have no information about which one are better so far, and we need more research to know that. And then there are many more problems with metadata again, and it's a bit strange because in the literature, I said before that they are not discussing how they operationalize, but they are also not mentioning when using metadata that metadata have errors. On the contrary, there are several papers that have been published that compare metadata and survey data, and any difference between the two, they call it bias in the survey data. So for them, the metadata is perfect. But in practice, of course, this is very far from being the case. So the goal of the project was first to identify the errors that we may have in metadata, because this was not an information that existed before, then to estimate the size of at least some of these errors, find ways to minimize them, and finally to correct for them. So in the first step, what we have been doing, again with Oriol Bosch, is to create a total error framework for metadata, which is based on the total survey error framework, the famous one, but we try to adapt it to metadata to provide an overview of really all the possible errors and the potential causes behind these errors. So basically, we find something that looks like that. So you can see there are many errors, and actually it didn't fit all on the slide, so there are more than that. And it's clearly wrong to just assume that metadata are perfect and the only difference with survey data is survey errors. That's clearly not the case. I'm not going to explain all the errors because otherwise we are here until tomorrow, but I just want to emphasize a couple of them that I think are particularly problematic. The first one is the fact that the panelists, the people that are participating in this meta research, they can install the tracker on a device that is shared with other person, which means that you are not only observing the online activity of your sampling unit, but you also observe what other persons are doing on this device. And this can, of course, lead to very wrong conclusions. So let's imagine that you are interested in this panel for Spain, so the meta panel for Spain, and you have a French girl within the Spanish panel. And then you observe the metadata for this person, and you will see that half of the URL that are visited are for French newspaper, like Le Monde.fr, and the other half are from Spanish newspapers, so it's something like El Mundo.es. So you could make the conclusions that this migrant that is now in Spain has half-half of media exposure from news from the home country and from the news country. But actually, in practice, it might just be that the device is shared with the husband that is Spanish and who is looking at all the Spanish websites while she is only looking at all the French ones. So your conclusions will be just completely wrong. Okay? Kind of on the opposite side, we also have the problem that Meta might not be installed or not on all the devices that people are using to go online. So for instance, I'm going online right now with this computer, but I'm not tracked for what I'm going to do right now with this computer. And it might be even much worse than that. It's not just that one time I use a computer, but I might have a smartphone and a PC at home and decide to install the Meta only on my smartphone or only on my PC at home. And there is also another problem, which is that just because of technology limitation, it's just not possible actually to track everything people are doing depending on the kind of device and the operating system. So there are different meta technology, but the one that is used by most people nowadays, most of the existing panel, is the one that is from Wakupa, which first was a Dutch firm, but it has been bought by others, so now I'm not sure. And in this meta, one of the main limitations is that if people are using an iOS device, you cannot track anything of what they are doing within apps. Okay? So it means that what you would like to see is the complete online behavior of people to be able, for instance, to compute the time they spend reading news media. You would need to observe what they do in all the devices, all the browsers, and also the app that they have on these devices. But because they might not install the meta on some of them, or because of technology limitation, you might actually see only part of it. And this is a phenomenon that we call tracking under coverage. And Oriol, again, has been working on that, try to estimate the size of this phenomenon. And in the triple data across the 3 countries mentioned before, he finds that the tracking under coverage affected 80 to 85% of the participants. So really, most of the participants are not tracked, at least on some devices or browsers that they are using to go online. So if you want to compute total time of any kind of online activity, it means you will probably have something that is under the level that you really want. No? And if you want to compare groups, coming back to the idea of the migrants, so for instance, you are interested in the panel for Spain, and in Spain, there are quite few iOS in general, so the market share for iOS devices in Spain is only around 21%. But let's say that in the panel for Spain, you also have Americans that are still behaving like Americans, so they are not yet integrated into the new country. Then you would expect that around 57% of them have iOS devices because that's the share for the US. So the problem is that then if you compute the time they spend reading news, for instance, only about Spanish news, the Spanish people and the US people within the Spanish panel, well, you might miss really much more information for the Americans one than for the Spanish one. So at the end, you are kind of comparing with apple and orange things because of these technology limitations affecting differently different populations in your sample. And again, there are many more problems like that than that. The selection bias is again a clear problem. So the people that accept to share the matter are usually people that also participate more in surveys, like more to share information on Facebook or on social media in general, etc. So depending on your target population, it might be more or less, but you might expect some selection bias at least. And again, the data protection and ethical issues are really, really a big thing here, because in the URL that people are visiting, you might have names. For instance, if you go to your Facebook page, you might see the name in the URL, which means that this kind of data are highly sensitive, and the data protection is very complicated because it's very difficult to anonymize fully this kind of data. Now, I have to say that the problem is mainly on the meta panel company more than on the researcher normally, because you buy aggregated data, you don't buy all the URL one by one, but still as a researcher, you are still somehow responsible of taking care of all these kind of issues. You're also dependent on the private companies, which might become really a nightmare, and it's also more expensive. So to conclude, we were on this kind of small island of the survey world, and we found that the island was really getting small with all the water of problems around Earth and all these measurement errors around. And we saw this boat far away that was the new data, and we thought the boat will be big and save us, but then we moved to the new data boat, and we saw it was a very, very small boat, and actually it was maybe better to still have the survey very close by in case we would go to the water. And at the end, I think that now what we are feeling is like, even if you have both the new data and the survey data, we are still in the middle of an ocean of problems and errors everywhere. But we are not getting desperate. We just think that there are so much more research that is needed. So in particular, we have to learn much more about the errors that we have in these new types of data. Which are the types of errors, which is the size of the errors, how these errors really affect the conclusions we are interested in at the end, because we said, for instance, for the metadata, shared devices affect in one direction, and the fact that there is tracking under coverage affects in the other direction. So maybe at the end, somehow they compensate a little bit each other, and it's not that bad, but we don't know yet. We really need more research to know that. We also need more research to understand when to use this data and what are the mechanisms really that are behind the non-response or behind the fact that some people participate and those are not, and why or in which directions do we have potential selection bias for different kinds of populations of interest, etc. And finally, I think we also really need to understand better how to use this data. So when I started applying to the ERC, which was quite some years back already, I was more thinking we had the two options of replacing some survey questions or combining with survey questions. But now I think that replacing is probably not a very good idea, because we have seen that there are big errors on both sides, if you use the survey data and if you use the new data. So I'm more in the fact that now, well, we will have errors anywhere. We will have errors independently on the kind of data we are using. So probably it's better to acknowledge these errors and really think about the consequences of these errors. And then because of the errors, we might get different results. So the metadata might tell the information that it's 4, and then the survey data will say, no, it's 3. And we could just say, okay, so one is better than the other, and I should keep one, but I think it's more important to keep both and to learn also from the difference we have between the two. So by having actually different perspective on the same phenomenon, and in social science, the phenomena are quite complex, so it's very difficult to apprehend them completely with just one kind of data. So I think that the best is to have complementary information about this phenomenon to try to get a more complete picture of these realities that we are interested in. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Well, not quite, because we're going to have the debate. Thanks a lot, Melanie. I thought that was fascinating. The title of your presentation may have led some people to conclude that it was not about the workshop topic, but it was, basically all the time, because it was about bias, how to run into it, how to get rid of it, how to size it up. And I thought it was really brilliant. Also, from my taste, it is abundantly clear that the future of social research is, once again, mixed methods. But it's next generation mixed methods, where you would combine the part of these new data sources that we have a sufficient understanding of with more traditional methodology. And third, I think it's abundantly clear. I mean, there's these big SIR conferences that are sort of offspring of the Ezra franchise. Big SIR, that's big data meets survey research. I mean, that's basically what she's doing. It's about how to apply survey concepts about error sources to a kind of data that's been initially like a bit frivolous about what error actually was. I mean, the overexcitement initially in this brave new world of passive data, it's now given way to the acknowledgement that if you don't think about those sources of bias hard and fast, we're going to end up with the wrong kind of conclusions, which is precisely what you say. Anyway, I'm here in a moderator capacity now. I have like roughly 1 million questions for Melanie, but I won't ask any, and I'll give the floor to you. Please identify yourself for the record. We have a mic which Marta is going to pass around, and which I need you to use, please.
This is Evren Yalas from GRITIM UPF Pompeo Fabra, and I'm one of the organizing team. And so thank you very much for this fascinating talk. Yes, it's working now. And so it was great to see all these opportunities coming from these new methods and new data. And my question will be about the ethical issues and data protection you mentioned. So, and I would like to ask you practical tips about these issues, and also looking at considering your ERC application and that process. So some of the questions that came to my mind, one issue is obviously the consent, the big issue. So in traditional survey, we can get the consent at the beginning of the survey, and people are aware that they are at a survey answering the questions. But in the case of, for example, metered data, it's a continuous process. So where do you get the consent? Just in the beginning? Do you remind them? So how does it work? So this is one.
Maybe I answer and then, because otherwise I forget.
But they're all related. Okay. The other one is about data storage. So probably none of us here are experts on cyber security. Probably none of us experts on GDPR, or we are not lawyers, okay? So what would be your practical advice? Where to store this data, GDPR compliant place, how to provide cyber security to this data? So very practical advice. And the third one is about data minimization. It's good that we are extracting huge chunks of data. We love data. But how do we ensure data minimization while doing that? So I was going to ask you, how could you persuade the evaluate, for example, your ERC application, the ethics check part, how could you persuade the evaluators that this project was, compliant of all? I think this will be very also practically useful for everyone here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was 3 years speaking with them, and it's still not over, but we are fine for what we did so far and the next round of experiment, but I still have a check in September for the next ones. So it's not easy. It has not been, and it will not be, I think. For the metadata, since we use metadata from method panel, these data are not directly collected for us. They are collected by the companies to sell them to any kind of clients that might be interested in them. So actually, the company that is doing that is asking for consent before you install the application, and you have to install yourself the application on your device. So you cannot really do it without knowing it. No, it's a relatively complex process actually to install it. So that's the way the consent is covered for metadata, and the minimization, we apply it at our level, but we cannot do anything at the company level, which means that instead of buying the raw data, which besides would be very much more expensive and much more complicated for storage issue, etc., we only buy the data we need to answer specific research questions. So for instance, for the online media, we do not get any URL of the participants. What we get are variables that the company creates for us, which is about the time they spend on the list of URL that we have given in advance. No? So by giving the list in advance and asking for only what we need, we apply the minimization principles. No, but at the level of the company, it's outside of our scope. What we had to do is also to show that the company is GDPR compliant, even if they are doing it independently on us. So first, the company had to be selected through a public call. So that's a race now, I think, with ERCs. And within the public call, we had to add some clauses that were explicitly about the company, showing that they are doing things in the best way possible. So they had to have an ISO norm. They had to sign specific clauses. For instance, the GPS data we will collect with them, they cannot use it for anything else than just for what we want, because they are not doing it normally. This kind of clauses we had to include. And for the data protection, so once we have the data, how to save them, etc., well, we have to save them only in computers that are fixed ones, so they cannot be easily moved around, etc. We have to save them with passwords, and normally that's enough, because again, the more sensitive information, it's the panel company that has the information. So we had actually more problems in showing that the company is fulfilling with a lot of things than then on saving the data. Well, actually, we had to do one more step, which is that the panel company collects the data goes to the project ethic advisor. The ethic advisor checks the data again in case the company would not do it properly, and the ethic advisor changed the ID, that is the one that the company could relate with the names of the panelists, to one that only the ethic advisor knows, and then the ethic advisor sends us the data with this new ID, so he is the only one that could actually make a link with the panelist in case we would need that, because we could also not just anonymize, because if someone at some point would like his data to be deleted, we need to be able to come back to the person. And if we would see, for instance, in the visual data, some unexpected findings, like someone would send a picture of violence of a child, which would be really, really stupid, but let's say the person is not realizing what she is doing or whatever, we had to deal with this case in advance, even if we do not really expect it. And then we would need to actually tell it to the police. So we would need to be able to come back to the person. So that's why we had to keep the ID somehow, somewhere. But if the company has the ID, it was more possible that someone would hack at some point the company, even if they have a system in which the IDs are actually separated 10 steps from, I don't know exactly how, but something like that. But yeah, we had to do all this kind of stuff. And maybe just one more thing about the consent. In the consent also for visual data, for instance, it has to be explicit in the consent form at the beginning. We already have to say that they might be asked questions with visual data, because we did an experiment, so it was not all of them, but we have to say to all of them that it might happen, and they have to consent explicitly also to that. And to not share pictures of third parties.
Just a quick question. My name's Helen Packwood from the University of Edinburgh. Melanie, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. That was really helpful. I guess my question was really about your team, like the composition of it. I was just thinking how important, as you were talking, being in a multidisciplinary team might be, just in terms of what you're offering. So you might need the skills of a computer scientist, potentially, obviously somebody who's expert in developing surveys, depending on what you're interested in, somebody who's a demography background or criminologist, sociologist. how does that work in practice? Do you draw on different specialists, or do you have to be the fount of all knowledge? Just practically for those of us that are trying to tease this out, as Sebastian said about it being sort of mixed methods, the next generation. So in practice, how do we do that? Is it about drawing others? How does it work for you?
Well, the team that is really working in the project, so it's me, and then I have 3 PhD students, and they are all mostly from survey methodology background, but one of them was actually an engineer before working in a panel company before deciding to do the PhD, so he has a lot of experience also in programming and in running panels, etc. And one of them, he was more in sociology before, so she did her master in sociology and she worked also on that, so she has more background from that. And then the programmers, we worked directly with the fieldwork company that did the programming. So the programmers were not immediately in the teams, but they are actually, when I applied to the ERC, my idea was to contract programmers. And I had to make an amendment at the beginning of the project, which was quite complicated because the money moves from third parties to inside of the project. But when really thinking about it more seriously, having the programmers within the team was almost impossible because I needed people that had very specific knowledge for different parts. So at Sully, it was not just one programmer. We needed at least 3 different profiles of programming. And we needed them for a short time. So finding people that have such specific skills for just 2 months, it was almost impossible, and not paying them extremely highly also, so it was almost impossible to find. So that's why they accepted it to change it for using the panel company that is NetQuest that has also a lot of programmers, and therefore they could find all the different profiles within the company, and they could develop the tools for us.
Thank you very much. I'm also very, very interested in learning more about this because I'm mostly qualitative, from a qualitative perspective. And my name is Yolanda Lopez from the Technological University of Chemnitz. And I was wondering, what is your experience with the motivation of this, I assume from this pilot phase or this first phase of this experiment, because I'm thinking as someone that will be willing to participate in this survey. Sometimes, you're hesitating in participating in surveys, and I'm thinking in opening all these other sources. I don't know, I will be very interested to know what is your experience on this, maybe people willing to participate. You mentioned at some point that the willingness, maybe they are not participating because maybe they don't have the skills, but I would like to know a little bit more about this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, so we did actually previous studies really on willingness before starting with the experiments also, and the willingness change a lot depending on exactly which kind of data you want to ask. And for instance, people are much more willing to do alcohol test and send you the result than to share their Facebook profile, which can seem a bit strange somehow. So it really depends on the exact kind of data you may want. But in general, the willingness, it really depends. I think for the metadata, the willingness might be only something like 20%, and for sharing photos, it might be up to 90%. So it really depends on the task. And then we also ask about how they feel once they have done it. No? So at the end of the experiments we have done, we ask if they like sharing photos or if they like answering with voice, if they find it difficult or not. So we also had feedback in that way. And we're a bit disappointed because they didn't like it as much as we would like, for instance. But this was before the ERC, so it means we didn't have the tool that we have developed now. And we do hope that the tools that we have developed are much more friendly user than the ones we had, and that this can improve. We also think that another problem is that we did all the experiment within opt-in panels, which on one side I think is not a problem because that's where most of the research is done, but the problem is that people that don't like answering conventional surveys, they are not there. So it would be nice to be able, for instance, for the voice staff, to try it on a sample that is completely French people that have not answered any kind of a panel survey before. And we would say from the beginning, answering a survey is by answering the questions in voice and see, because people that are in a panel, they don't really care about typing. So yeah, I think that would be really nice to be able to try also on populations that are not accustomed to the classic way as well.
Hi, thank you very much. My question relates to the previous one, and it concerns the selection bias. So if you have this many different methods, the selection bias somehow adds up. And I wonder whether you have done any kind of methodological experiments or surveys that somehow identify the selection bias inherent to each of these sub-methods and how they add up.
Well, what we have done is in each of the experiments, then we did some regression to try to see which kind of variables affect the fact of participating or sending the images or answering through voice or these kind of things. We have also looked for the metadata, like step by step, who are the people that accept and then really share the data and then really stay in the panel for at least 3 weeks or for at least 3 months or for at least 6 months. So we have compared like on main demographics and also on some attitudinal variables. But here I didn't really put something because it's very difficult to generalize, because it really depends. For instance, right now, what we are working on with images, the experiment we will do is about parents of children that have children that are in 1st, 3rd, or 5th grades of primary school in Spain. So there, all we know about the bias for general population may completely not apply. So it really depends on these kind of things, and it also really depends on the tasks. So it's very different to ask for images than to ask for dictation. For instance, in dictation, yes, they have to speak, but the voice is immediately transcribed into a text. So I think the privacy issues are very limited compared to recording the voice or to sharing images. So yeah, there are so many elements that we don't really have a clear picture yet, and that's why I just mentioned it as a problem. But what I was saying before, the good point is that normally we have a lot of information about the ones that do not share also the new data types. So in terms of weighting, we really can use even hundreds variables sometimes, no? Because we really have all the answers to all the other questions except the ones about the new data. Or in the case on the meter, they also answer surveys. So you can have all the information you want about the people that are sharing or not sharing the meter from the survey. No?
Actually, I must confess, when I saw that picture with the boat and the island, I thought she was really going to map the ocean rather than get on the boat to get away. So there's a lot of work to do, clearly. Maybe we can have like one or tops 2 very good questions. One is going to come from Michael Hahn. That was Vera Messing asking before. Then somebody else, yeah, okay, Ricardo. And then I think we will wrap it up, not for lack of interest, but for lack of time.
This is a lot of pressure. Thank you, Melanie. That was a fascinating presentation. I don't work with aggregated data, so this may not make sense, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how aggregated these data are. Do you get the geocoding information from individuals? Do you have anything about what, an individual's age, sex, etc.? And the reason I ask is because, what you might be able to do is look at the estimates of online media consumption you're getting through your collection techniques, the aggregated data, and compare it to an existing survey, because that would allow you to kind of go down the road a little bit in terms of estimating bias. Maybe you're doing a great job for 25 to 34-year-olds, but not such a good job for 65-plus-year-olds. Maybe you've already done that, but I thought, I'd just ask.
Yeah, well, the paper is still under progress. It's not finished, but that's the kind of things that we are looking at. No? So, yeah.
That was quick.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, Riccardo Ladini, University of Milan. I like very much your talk, very inspiring, and I have a question, which probably it is the next step of your research agenda. about the cross-country comparability of this kind of measure, because many of us know that there are limitations in the surveys, but the systematization of surveys allow us with some limitation, as we know, to compare across country, across time. And as you told about the difficulty of measuring with the matter and so on, there are strong issues about comparability within the same context, in the same measure. What about your insight about cross-country comparability by using this kind of data, integrated them with survey?
Well, I think it's a bit early to think about time yet, because we are learning so much. Then I would say the way we are doing it right now, probably we learn and we try to improve it next time. So I don't think we are yet ready for having a way of doing it that we will keep still across time. But I hope that comes next, indeed, as you said. But I think all these kinds of data, they are already used, but without methodological research. That's a problem, no? I mean, the metadata, more than 70 papers, that's not nothing. But none of them is about metals, and they just use the meta. Actually, I don't really know how. Probably they ask a meta panel company to compute that, and the panel company might have done it without any instructions, and it might be completely wrong, because from our experience, when they extracted the data, it took like 6 months back and forth until they did it the way we wanted. No? So if you don't tell them and don't check what they did, it might be anything, but that's what we see in the literature so far. So we really need to develop all this research, but there is so little that I'm not yet thinking about, like so long time. Then in terms of comparing countries or comparing cultures and so on, I think it's also very interesting, these new kinds of data, because we do not have as much problems in translation, for instance, as in survey. Now, if they send pictures, then the problem of extracting is the same if they come from one country or from another. So we get rid of many problems we had about cultural interpretation, maybe, of some of the answer categories, like what is somehow, or things like that. No? And the same for metadata. Then we may have less problems to compare across countries than what we have with surveys, except what I said before, like if the technology limitations are different across countries because of the share of iOS being different. But I think that's still less than the problems we have with surveys, probably.
All right. Well, I said two. One was very quick. We can have la penultima, como dicen en español. Anybody else, or shall we leave it here? A show of hands, please. Is it okay with you that we leave the refreshment break for just 15 minutes? There's some buffer there that was politely included in the program without much wording. So I think we could resume at like 10 past, max 15 past 6. If that's okay with you, please take advantage for uploading your presentations if you're part of the next panel. And well, I would like to again thank Melanie very, very much indeed.
Thank you.